Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to the course code Eng455, lecture number 26. As you can see, this is the continuation of our lecture series on historical linguistics, or about the history of linguistics. And today's our main focus would be on Noam Chomsky. But what we have done so far with respect to this historical linguistics, in our previous lecture, we talked about the study of language thing, the discipline of this, the existence of this discipline was already there, related to the study of language, even before this linguistics during the 19th century. But it was Ferdinand de Saussure who actually laid the basis or the foundations of modern linguistics. And the era was 20th century. With Ferdinand de Saussure, we can say the modern linguistics, it established itself as a separate discipline of knowledge, different from all the traditional studies about the language and its nature. Ferdinand de Saussure proposed the theory of structuralism, which talked about the language as a structure, language as a system, a self-contained and self-regulating system, a system which is a part of a bigger system of speech, but at the same time, it itself is a self-contained system. We talked about the different ideas of Saussure about this language as a system, like language as a system of signs, language as a system of differences, and language as not a nomenclature. So many ideas about structuralism theory were there. Because the Ferdinand de Saussure, he was the pioneer of this theory, so his ideas, they are considered as the basic principles of structuralist theory. Later on, from Saussure, this theory, it got popularity and was adopted by many other linguists as well. But this as an important building block of the field of linguistics, but at the same time, the structuralism, it has certain weaknesses. The structuralism, it talked about the structure of the language, not taking into account the functional use of language. So there were certain flaws which made the other linguists to talk about these flaws and to talk about language, in a different way, in a way different from Saussure. So that in the second period of historical linguistics, we have another school of thought that we are going to deal with today, that is of generative linguistics. A big name of in linguistics is associated with it, that is Noam Chomsky, the founder of generative linguistics. And he in contrast to Saussure ideas, he also proposed some of his ideas about the language and its nature. Then he, as Chomsky was the one who criticized with the structuralism ideas are fine with phonology and morphology, but the problem with structuralism idea emerges when we talk about the syntax of language. So Chomsky idea to highlight that flaws in structuralism, as well as to provide with the remedies to talk about the structure of the language in a better way, about the syntax of a language in a better way. The Chomsky's ideas, you will say the majority of the Chomsky ideas, they are more concerned with the syntax. They are more concerned about the structure of language, structure of words in the formation of phrases and sentences. And in this regard, he presented three major theories about grammar, known as phrase structure grammar, and transformational grammar, and generative grammar. These three theories, they all talked about the syntax. They all proposed their ideas about the syntactic analysis of language. These theories, we have discussed them in detail in our lecture on syntax. So if you want to see the details of these theories, you have to refer back to that lecture on syntax. But over here, I will just highlight some of the major ideas of Chomsky about these grammars, as well as about some other ideas about the language. So so we will discuss them, and at the same time we will discuss discuss an important term, the Chomsky idea of first language acquisition. Beside the language, beside the syntax of language, he proposed certain ideas about the acquisitions of language, that how this language is acquired, and this theory is named as nativism or innatism by many linguists. And in that theory, he talked about the LAD, the language acquisition device, and idea of universal grammar. So all of these ideas we are going to discuss today. Let's start with Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, a new paradigm in modern linguistics. As I told you, a Ferdinand de Saussure is the father of modern linguistics, laid basis for the study of linguistics. Noam Chomsky is such a big name in that field of linguistics because his ideas were revolutionary, and till date his ideas are quoted in every area of knowledge with respect to linguistics. Whenever you want to explain something, you quote Noam Chomsky, you talk about Chomsky, you provide with his ideas, you talk about his example, and he talked about language. He presented with so many ideas about language, so we can say that is a new paradigm, a new shift in modern linguistics from structuralism to another revolutionary nature of modern linguistics. Now, generative linguistics, this is a school of thought in with respect to the different schools of thought in history of linguistics, but the proponent is Noam Chomsky. He is the founder of the school of thought known as generative grammar, and he was the first one who made use this idea of generative grammar. Now, when he presented this idea, 1959, he published his book that is Syntactic Structures, and in that book he came up with this new ideas about modern linguistics, about the idea of generative grammar, about the idea of transformational generative grammar, about the universal, so many ideas he introduced, especially in this book Syntactic Structures. And in that syntactic structures, when he talked about the analysis of syntactic structures of languages, he proposed different types of theories like finite state grammar, phrase structure grammar, transformational generative grammar. But the most famous theory, the theory that got popularity out of that, was transformational generative grammar, or some people they also call it the theory, the branch that only deals with transformational generative grammar is known as transformational generative linguistics. So all of these ideas were important related to Chomsky. Before going to into detail of what Chomsky said about language and first language acquisition, or about the syntactic relationships of language, let's have a brief overlook about his lifespan. He was born on December 7, 1928, attended the University of Pennsylvania, where he met Zelling Harris. Now, Zelling Harris, I must introduce you another important linguist he is. He was also famous for some of his ideas about the language. And as the Chomsky, he was the student of Zelling Harris. He was the companion of Zelling Harris. So he was inspired by the ideas of Zelling Harris. So some of his theories, you will see that they are you can consider them as inspirations from Zelling Harris. In 1949, he graduated with a BA, and thesis was about modern Hebrew, a classical language, and then entered to graduate school. 1959, he became one of the society fellows at Harvard University, where he moved to Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1955. MIT he joined in 1955. He has been repeatedly, now over here about his personal life, this is important to highlight that he was many times he was sent to jail because he was a political activism. Beside a linguist, he was a very much active politician as well. He criticized so many, whenever there was a government, he was used to criticize different ideas of that government, different perspectives of that grammar, and that's why he was sent to jail for many times. But that was his personal political career. But on the side of linguistics, he is a well-known, well-established name. Then he has been influenced by variety of thinkers, philosophers, politicians and linguists. So as you will see, his work is a mixture of all these things. His ideas are political as well as linguistics as well as philosophical, and having a great depth of knowledge inside them. And many people, they compare him, the critics, they compare him to Bertrand Russell. If you know, Bertrand Russell, a very well known literary person, a literary figure in the history of literature. So his ideas, his philosophical ideas about language, because of that he is compared to the Bertrand Russell, that his ideas are as philosophical as Bertrand Russell's ideas are. Now Chomsky, as I told you, big name, and many people they say different things about Chomsky, but over here I would like to quote Smith, 2004, page number 16. He said about Chomsky that he has shown that there is really one human language. The greatest contribution of Chomsky is that he came up with an idea that okay, there is one human language. There is on the top, there is one human language, and the different people, different cultures, we are variations of that one human language. If you have any idea of universal grammar, on the basis of that Chomsky, he talks about the universality of language. Then further he talks about the immense complexity of the innumerable languages we hear around us must be variations on a single theme. He says, according to Chomsky, there is one single human language, and the different languages, they are the variations. The variations of one single theme. He has revolutionized linguistics, a big compliment to him, and in doing so has set a cat among the philosophical pigeons. Again, the big philosophical pigeons are the other linguists who are talking about presenting different theories, and he is a cat chasing them. Because Chomsky is very much famous for criticizing different theories and then presenting with his own theories, and pointing out drawbacks and flaws in different theories, like structuralism. He highlighted the weaknesses of structuralism and presented a better theory. Then he highlighted for example, the flaws in B.F. Skinner behaviorist theory and presented his own theory. So this way you can say he is a cat chasing pigeons. He is a cat chasing the weaknesses of the other different linguists, and then presented his big theory. So his name is considered as such a big name in modern linguistics. Now let's talk about what are the different ideas that were proposed by Chomsky about language. What makes him such a big linguist? Number one, he defined language. He provided with the definitions of language. According to Saussure, the language is a structure, that's it. Language is a system of sound, that's it. Language is a system of difference, that is. Totally focusing on language structure or language form. But Chomsky provided another a bit better definition, that is, a language is a set. Now it can be an infinite or it can be a finite set of sentences, each finite in length and constructed out of a finite set of elements. A very syntactical type of definition, you can say, because as I told you that Chomsky was more concerned about the syntactic view of language, about the syntax. So his definition of language is very much the same with the syntactical type of definition, because according to him, if you talk about any language, it is a set of sentences, and definitely to convey my meanings we need to use sentences rather than the words. So when I talk in sentences, not in random chunks of words. So sentences are the major building blocks in language. So language is basically composed of these sentences. And how these sentences are formed? These sentences, they are actually finite in length, they have a length to convey their meaning. Plus, they are made up of certain rules. As you know, what are these syntactic rules? Which tells us, okay, follow the word order like subject, verb, object. Follow the thing that the transitive verbs, they need an object, the intransitive verbs, they do not need an object. So these things out there are the syntactic rules, which tells us so many things, that how a good grammatically and semantically perfect sentence can be created. So this way language is all about the sentences. Further, language is a system represented in mind, brain of a particular individual. This thing is again a very much particular, a striking one idea. He was the first one who introduced this idea that language is something, a system that is in brain. Present with reference to first language acquisition theory, he proposed this idea that language is something which is there in our brain, in brains of a particular individual. And we do not need to we use these languages, we learn do not need to learn them. Rather, we develop these skills. Rather, we develop language just like we develop other physical abilities. Like a child is not taught how to walk, but still he starts walking. Similarly, according to him, the child acquires the language. So because the language is already there, something natural is already there in the mind of the children, and so language is a system that is represented in brain. So these are the two main definitions. The first theory is more related to his syntactic view of language. The second theory is more related to his about nature of language, the way it is acquired, to explain the phenomena of first language acquisition. Another important definition that are provided by Chomsky, idea famous for Chomsky, is competence and performance. Now here, competence and performance idea can be compared to Saussure ideas, because if you remember, the Saussure presented that a language is comprised of langue and parole. Langue is your knowledge of language, parole is your performance of language. The same idea is taken by Chomsky to introduce the terms competence and performance. Competence is your knowledge of language, the speaker's, hearer's unconscious knowledge of language, about sounds, meanings and syntax. When you learn a language, you acquire a language, first language, you unconsciously absorb these meanings. You know, when you hear the word door at the very first level, at the very first time, you get its meaning in association with something. And then you know what the door is. You learn. Similarly, this competence is actually the unconscious knowledge about language, and that knowledge is where? In your brain. On the other hand, performance is just like a parole, the actual use of language. It is the way that speakers or the hearers, they use language in concrete life situations. So if you define it, competence and performance, compare it, it is something like langue and parole. But competence, because it is where? It is in brain, so it is your mental reality, because it lies in your brain. Whereas performance is your about actual physical actions. So performance is observable. And whereas competence, because this is knowledge, definitely you cannot open my brain, cannot see that knowledge. So performance, the competence, it is hidden, it is not observable, it is mental. Whereas performance, it is observable. You can see how I use language. It is my actual use. It is observable, it is physical, because my auditory vocal organs are involved in this process. So this is not a mental, rather a physical activity. So this way you can compare competence with performance. And at the same time, you can compare this idea of competence and performance with a Saussure idea of langue and parole. Now, when talking about that what a language is, what are the different areas in language, then Chomsky, just like Saussure, also defines the aims of linguistics. If you remember, the Saussure idea about the aim of linguistics was to study language, not speech. But Chomsky idea about aims of linguistics is that the major aims of linguistics are to know what constitutes language. What makes language? What are the things which are there in language? And remember, according to Chomsky, a language is a set of sentences. So actually, to know about the constituents of language means to know about the constituents of sentences. That is what is the aim of linguistics. Further, how is such knowledge acquired? Again, how the language is acquired by children. Again, as you know, the Chomsky presented his theories on first language acquisition. The aims of linguistics is to explain that how the languages, they are acquired and how they are learned. And thirdly, how is such knowledge put to use? performance of language, that how the people they use the language in actual life situations. This should be studied by linguistics to pave ways for the, and this pave way for the study of pragmatics, you know, which is about the actual use of language in actual concrete situations. It is not about the meanings of the language which are inside the language, rather it is the meanings of language that are composed, that emerges in a relation of language with the actual life situation, the context. So a linguist should be concerned about these things. And finally, a linguist should be concerned with what are the physical mechanisms that serve as the material basis for this system of knowledge and for its use. What are the physical mechanisms? Now, what is meant by this word mechanism? What should be there in linguistics? Yes, the phonetics, articulatory and acoustic and auditory phonetics, how we produce sound, how we produce language, how we hear language, and how the language it travels in the sound form of sound waves. This it should also be the focus of linguistics. So Chomsky, he actually tried to define the this area of linguistics where it should work. It tried to define the objectives that should be of concern with for linguists. As a linguist, I should be concerned with all these things, and as a linguistics as a discipline should focus these areas, because these all areas, they are somehow related to language. Now, because if you remember the first definition of language by Chomsky is a set, and the language is a set of sentences. So, according to Chomsky, language is structure dependent. Now, if the question emerges that Saussure idea was about language was structure dependent, and Chomsky idea is also about structure dependent. So, what is the difference? The difference is that the socio-structuralism was more about the structures of single words at morphological and phonological level, whereas on the other hand, the Chomsky's idea about the structure of language is at syntax level. So this is the way Chomsky is somehow, his generative or transformational grammar can be considered as an offshoot of structuralism, but at the same time he is talking about sentences. So, according to Chomsky, language is structure dependent, a principle common to all languages. Syntax is more than meaning. This is again, you will see later on that how this was proved as a drawback of Chomsky, and as a result, the functional linguistics as a different schools of thought emerged. Because all these linguistics like Saussure and Chomsky, they were more focused with the structure of language. They considered the structure of language as more important. So the sentences, they get their meaning from the structure rather than the actual meanings. Chomsky asserts that knowledge of language relies on the structural relationships in the sentence rather than on sequence of words. The sequence of words are not important in a sentence. The relationship of words in the sentence are important. Again, he was not concerned with the paradigmatic view of syntax, rather he was concerned with the syntagmatic view of syntax. Again, within syntax he has further distinction, that he is concerned with syntactic relationship of the words within sentences rather than their sequence or something like that. For example, look at these examples. The man who is tall is John. Is the man who is tall John? Now look at this picture. If you want to make a question out of a simple declarative statement, this is the way you need to alter the structure according to certain rules. Now you cannot say that, okay, making a question means that you take the auxiliary at the first position. Is the man who tall is John? Incorrect structure. Because language is all about the structure. In languages, structures are important to convey the grammatically perfect sentences. So that's why Chomsky talks about language as structure dependent. And because his focus was more on syntax, that's why he considered syntax as more important than meaning. For example, well-formed sentence without meaning. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Though this idea is not meaningful, but this is because this is syntactically perfect, so it would mean the listener or the reader would try to create any sort of meaning. He would try to get any meaning out of it. Maybe a literary meaning is inside there, maybe a figurative meaning is inside there. So the perfect structure is necessary. But on the other hand, if you distort the structure, ideas furiously green, colorless sleep, if you distort the structure, then sentence is totally meaningless. So the syntax is important. Syntax is there, though the meaning is not there, but still it is creating some sort of sense. But if you change the syntax, if you distort the syntax, the meanings just get on the side. The structures do not make them a good sentences. So according to Chomsky, syntax is more important than meaning part. Now, because Chomsky's ideas were more related about the syntax, more related toward the grammatical aspects of language, so on the basis of these ideas, Chomsky presented 3 models of grammar in his book Syntactic Structure. But let me make it clear, he presented actually 4. The first one was finite state grammar, which was heavily rejected and heavily criticized, and he himself rejected that idea. He talked about different finite state grammar ideas, and he rejected them, and then presented the 3 famous models of grammar: phrase structure grammar, transformational generative grammar. Transformational generative grammar, please, these are 2, transformational grammar and generative grammar. They are 2 mean things. And transformational generative grammar idea is again derived from phrase structure grammar. And with respect to syntax, with respect to syntactic analysis, till today, these 2 approaches to grammar are considered very much valid with respect to syntactic analysis. The linguists, they adopt these models to analyze languages. They use these models to explain the structure of languages. So these ideas are very much popular. So because phrase structure grammar in phrase structure grammar, after phrase structure grammar, he came up with transformational generative grammar. But transformational generative grammar is actually the further extension of phrase structure grammar. So it's better to just start with phrase structure grammar. So let's see what phrase structure grammar is. A phrase structure grammar states rules for determining the structure of phrases. It more focuses on the phrases within the sentences that generate a lot of sentences from a small number of rules. Now actually the phrase structure grammar, its basic focus is on phrase, that a sentence, it is comprised of phrases. So when you analyze a sentence, you separate different phrases. Actually, analysis of a language or analysis of sentences involves the separation of different phrases and then further analysis of that phrases. So that's why this is known as phrase structure grammar. And once again, if you focus the phrase structure of sentences, then you can develop certain fixed number of rules. And out of that fixed number of rules, you can have infinite number of sentences, can have many number of sentences. So small number of rules you can make, and out of that small number rules you can generate so many sentences. And so we will state these rules further. But at the same time, the structure of a phrase will consist of one or more constituents in certain order. The order thing is very important. You need to arrange the phrases in a certain order inside a sentence, and at the same time these phrases, they are composed of certain constituents. So this constituency factor is very much important in formulation of phrases. What is this constituent? For example, look at over here the example. The crazy man is jumping off the bridge. Now some words they seem to belong together, like the crazy man and is jumping off the bridge. The crazy man, before the phrase structure grammar, the names given these parts of the sentences were the subject and predicate. But with this phrase structure grammar, they consider that the crazy man, it stands separately from the remaining portion of the sentence. And the crazy man, these words they have certain type of relationship, and then they stand together. This relationship makes them to stand together. What is the relationship? The relationship is if I define it, the crazy man, I can see that this is the whole all three words, they are talking about one single thing, about the man. So the is referring to the man as an article, crazy is attributing man, so the man is the head. So this way these words they seem to belong together, and this way we can separate it as a phrase. Similarly is jumping off the bridge. Now all is about certain activity, and all the word they are making one meaning clear. So we can put it like a verb phrase, that because this is about an action, it is a verb phrase. Yes, but inside that verb phrase we can further categorize different phrases, like we can see that is jumping off the bridge. Is and jumping, they are verbs, but off the bridge, again a type of phrase, prepositional phrase, because it is telling what he is doing from where, off the bridge. Okay, so you out and off the bridge, a prepositional phrase, and then off the bridge, inside that prepositional phrase you have off as preposition and the bridge again as a noun phrase. So this way the constituents means the group of words that seem to belong together. They have some type of a relationship with each other. Now, and such words, groups of words that seem to belong together are known as constituents. The constituents phrases, and the component that determines the properties of that constituent is the head. For example, in the crazy man, the head word was noun, man, and man is a noun, so this constituent is a noun phrase. Is jumping off the bridge. This all about is one action, that is jumping. So jumping is a verb, so this is all verb phrase. So there is always inside a phrase we have heads and we have other explanatory items, and head defines the nature of that phrase. Some more examples to explain this thing. For example, look at the first example, run a marathon. Now run a marathon, what do you think, that should the run, the verb should be the head, or the marathon should be the head? Definitely run. So this is a verb phrase made up of one verb, a determiner, marathon, noun. Eat the food, eat verb, determiner the, food, noun. Read the book, verb, determiner, noun. So this way we can have the constituents element verb phrases. But if these are the verb phrases, remember inside verb phrases we can have verb and we can have other phrases as well. As I explained previously, that is jumping off the bridge, so total verb phrase, but inside that verb phrase again a prepositional phrase, off the bridge. So similarly in phrases, verb phrases especially, we can have further phrases. Like we can have a noun phrase, we can have a prepositional phrase. So simply what rule we can make? Verb phrase can have a verb, noun phrase, prepositional phrase. Look at the lowest line, the bottom line at the bottom. This makes a rule. Verb phrase is comprised of a verb, and it can have a noun phrase, plus it can have a prepositional phrase, and inside prepositional phrase we can have further phrases. But this is this is the maximum possible structure of a verb phrase. So on the basis of all these verb phrases, their types, the noun phrases, all the phrases and their types, the Chomsky made certain rules in phrase structure grammar. And these phrase structure rules are that at the top level a sentence S, represented with S, can have a noun phrase and a verb phrase, mean binary division. Inside a noun phrase, we can have a determiner, we can have a noun, we can have a pronoun. Inside a verb phrase, we can have verb, noun phrase, prepositional phrase, and adverb. Inside a prepositional phrase, we can again have a preposition as a noun phrase. Then we can have an appositive phrase where there is an appositive as a prepositional phrase. So these are the 5 rules, and usually the sentences, they have these structure. So you can have a phrase structure analysis on the basis of these rules. I mean, look at this example, that phrase structure rules. The way you can make divide these with respect to phrase structure grammar, you can divide them into different parts. Like the boy, a noun phrase comprised of now an article and a noun. The boy in the yard, the whole is comprised of an article, noun, and a prepositional phrase. And inside prepositional phrase, in the yard, in is a preposition, the yard again a noun phrase, and the yard noun phrase comprised of determiner the and a noun yard. So this way, you, with the help of phrase structure grammar, you can analyze phrases and sentences. But there are certain limitations with respect to phrase structure grammar, that the rules are mostly context free. They do not make the context clear with respect to this. For example, the boy saw the man with a telescope. Now the man was having a telescope, or the boy used a telescope to see the mean. The context is not clear. Until and unless we have a proper picture in front of it, we cannot get the context of the sentence. So the phrase structure grammars, they do not explain the context. The rules explain intra-sentence constituent elements rather than intra-sentence relationship. Mean more the syntax is concerned rather than the syntactic relationship. Again, ambiguous sentences cannot be explained, and because of these problems that emerged with phrase structure grammar, Chomsky himself presented the idea of transformational generative grammar. But before going into detail of transformational generative grammar, we need to see another important idea of Chomsky about deep and surface structure. So let's see what these are. Actually, syntactic relationships, according to Chomsky, are of 2 levels of representation: deep structure and surface structure representation. The surface structure representation, they are the derived surface forms. Mean they have a deep structure in their roots, and the surface representations of the deep structures are known as SS surface structure. And whereas the deep structure, it is the underlying representation. It would be more clear with this example. The deep structure is an abstract level of structural organization in which all the elements determining structural interpretation are represented. Sentences that have alternate mean that sentences are single sentences that can have further representations. That is a deep structure, and that further representations are the surface structures. Actually, the deep structure is at the depth root, and surface structures are derivations of that this deep structure. Now look at these examples. Charlie broke the window. The window was broken by Charlie. Charlie, who broke the window? Was the window broken by Charlie? Now look at all these sentences. There is one underlying idea behind these sentences. What is that? The Charlie broke the window. That is the main basic idea. So the Charlie broke the window is actually the deep structure. In the first sentence, Charlie broke the window is a deep structure. So all other 3 sentences, they are derived from that deep structure. So they are the surface representation. So below 3 sentences, the window was broken by Charlie, Charlie who broke the window, or was the window broken by Charlie? These are surface structures. So different, and all these, they have the difference in their surface structure, difference in their syntactic form, but they have one deep structure or underlying structure, that is Charlie broke the window. And you are changing that deep structure to get different derivative forms. So this was his idea about deep and surface structure, and from this idea of deep and surface structure, the idea of transformational and generative grammar emerged. So deep and surface structures, they talk about how superficially similar sentences are different, like Annie whacked the man with an umbrella. Now the umbrella was with the man, or umbrella was something that was used by Annie to whack the man. So again, this kind of deep and surface structure you can only tell with the help of deep and surface structure distinction. And some surface structures but different deep structure. The boy saw the man with a telescope. Surfacely, now look at these two sentences. Annie whacked the man with an umbrella. The boy saw the man with a telescope. Both sentences are syntactically same, but meanings are different. So this way we rely on the idea of deep and surface structures to get the understanding of ambiguous sentences. As I mentioned, that from this idea of deep and surface structures, the idea of transformational generative grammar emerged. And this transformational generative grammar, it is divided into two areas of transformational and generative. Transformational is a method of stating how the structures of many languages can be generated or explained as the result of specific transformations applied to certain basic structure. Now basic structure, deep structure. Like, and we have one deep structure and we transform its shape to make different. For example, I have a statement, I saw the man, and I want to make a negative. I saw the man, I didn't see the man. So again, once deep structure, and to make a negative, I have transformed its surface shape. So that surface structure is actually the transformed form of deep structure. This is the idea of transformation. Similarly, to make an active passive, Charlie broke the window was broken by Charlie. Same meanings are conveyed. But my deep structure is Charlie broke the window, and I changed its shape, I transformed its shape to get the passive. So the passive is actually the transformed form of deep structure. So this way we get the transformation. This idea is the basic to this transformational grammar. Then again, I should make it clear, to go into the detail of these grammars, you should refer back to the syntax lectures, but here I am just going through to quickly make you familiar with the ideas proposed by Chomsky in a summarized form. Over here I have, from the idea of transformational grammar, these are certain rules of transformation which were explained by Chomsky. Like he said that there are prescriptive and normative rules, which prescriptive and normative rules are related to traditional grammar ideas. That, for example, they say do not avoid ending a sentence with preposition. It is purely a traditional idea, but in English some ideas we are still following from the traditional grammar. So this idea is prescriptive rule in transformational rule. Then we have descriptive rules. For example, why to use s with a in simple present tense, why to use s with a singular subject, like I make but he makes, you make but you make but she makes. So this way, and they make, so how we cannot explain the nature of these rules, but again we describe them the way they are. So these are the descriptive rules. Then we have rewrite rules, we can break down the sentences and we can represent them in phrase structure grammar rules. So this is a rewrite rule. We have interrogative rules to make interrogative sentences, like I can read, can I read? Affix switch rules, where we changes the places of affixes, fixes, like he is going, is he going? Do sport rules that make use of do not, and does not to make negative, or use of do and does and to make interrogative in simple present tenses. Then negation rules are there to make negatives, and passivization rules are there to make the passive sentences. So these are some of the transformational rules which are applied to transform deep structures and to get surface structures. Then we have generative grammar. Formally, a generative grammar is defined as that is fully explicit. It is a finite set of rules that can be applied to generate all those and only those sentences, often but not necessarily infinite in number, that are grammatical in a given language. Means so generative is about generation. If transformational grammar is about transformations, generative linguistics is about generation. In transformational grammar, we talk about how the sentences, they are transformed, they transform their shape. But in generative linguistics, we talk about the rules on the basis of which we can generate sentences. According to Chomsky, in every language we can have a finite number of sentences which can be derived from a finite number of rules. So we have certain rules. Whatever the sentences that we will generate would follow those rules. So this way, this idea of generative grammar is basically talks about generation of sentences. And what are the properties of generative grammar? That it includes whatever in phrase structure grammar was missing, whatever was in transformational grammar was not beyond explanation. So generative, because the phrase structure grammar and the transformational grammar, they do not take into account the creativity element in language. Whereas generative grammar takes about generativity in sentences, so takes into account the creativity in language. Plus, the generative grammar has finite number of rules but capable to produce infinite number of structures. In this way, productivity in language is covered. Now, Chomsky is about language. Now, another stance where Chomsky criticized behaviorism. Behaviorism is actually the school of thought is typically associated with B.F. Skinner, a behaviorist, who proposed in 1950 a theory about language acquisition. According to B.F. Skinner, that the language learning, the human beings, they learn language in the same way that we explain the idea of habit formation. According to B.F. Skinner, we always have a stimulus, and for that stimulus we respond. And when we respond, we get reinforcement for that. And as a result, we develop a habit. So this habit formation originates from stimulus. For example, he experimented on different creatures, like on mice. He conducted so many experiments that when a mouse, he sees the sight of food and he is hungry, so he jumps to take that food. Now the stimuli is that food. The response of the mouse would be that he would jump onto that food. That is response. Now, will you give him food or not? That is reinforcement. And depending on that reinforcement, the habit of the mouse would be developed. So similarly, in human beings, as human beings, we get stimuli, we respond to these stimuli. And when we get reinforcement for these our actions, our habits are developed. So similarly, now Skinner compares this process with the language acquisition process. According to him, similarly, the children, they learn the language by imitating and repeating the things. And mind is nothing. Mind is not at all involved in this process. Mind is just a blank state at birth. When we are exposed to this environment after birth, the people are all around us, producing sounds, using words, sentences. And we as children, we try to imitate them. And imitation plus practice helps us to develop language. So this is the way the language is acquired by children. But Chomsky totally criticized this point of view. According to Chomsky, children are this is the way they are totally in contrast. The Skinner believes on a habit formation process, believes on the repetition model, imitation model. The Chomsky gives value to brain in language learning. For Skinner, the brain has no importance as this role, and for Chomsky, the whole role is of brain. It is according to him, the children, they are biologically designed to get this language. And Chomsky, the famous word by Chomsky is that we learn the language the way we learn the walking. The children learn walking. Nobody tells them how to use their legs and to how to start walking. They just start walking on their own. Similarly, language is something that is not taught to them. They are biologically designed to learn that language. They have certain devices already there in brain which help them to acquire that language, and according to the language they are exposed to, they acquire the language. So it is the brain which plays the most important role in this process. So from here the Chomsky proposed his idea of language, his theory of language, first language acquisition. According to this Chomsky theory of first language acquisition, we are designed to walk, that we are taught to walk is impossible. And pretty much the same is true of language. Nobody is taught language. In fact, you can't prevent a child from learning it. You cannot make children that do not learn a language. They would learn it because the biologically designing is in such a way that they acquire the language. And what are the things in brain which help them to acquire this language? He mentions two things, LAD and UG. LAD, language acquisition device, and UG, idea of UG is actually the universal grammar idea. These two ideas are the backbones of Chomsky's theory of first language acquisition. So let's see what these things are. Now, what is the Chomsky idea of universal grammar? Actually, this concept of universal grammar is that there is a system of principles, conditions and rules that are elements or properties of all human languages. So basically this idea of universal grammar is about the universality of language. That again, for Chomsky, that all the languages, that basically there is one human language, and all these languages like English, Urdu, Turkish, Chinese, Arabic, they are the variations of one human language. So on the whole, we have certain ideas which are universal, which are principles which are universal, what are conditions inside all the languages which are universal, and that universality is the essence of human language. So basically one human language having different variations, and basically they all belong to one human language, that is universality. And all human beings, they share part of their knowledge of language, that is universal grammar, existing as part of language competence. We have this knowledge already with us in our brains. And for example, he gives an example that speakers knows a set of principles that apply to all languages, and parameters that vary within clearly defined limits from one language to another. For example, I know that in English I have a subject verb object order. So I believe that in all languages the word order is important and word order is there. So this idea of word order is universal to all languages. So this idea of your word order, I can say, is the essence of human language. So this way there are certain things which are universal to all languages, making the idea of universal grammar more strong. And basically from where he got this idea, actually to explain that language is already there in brain, and to explain the grammar of language, and at the same time to explain its relationship with mind and brain, he integrated all these concepts and came up with the idea of universal grammar to defend himself that okay, language is there in the human beings. And the device he named for having this universal grammar is LAD, or LAD. LAD stands for actually language acquisition devices. What is it? It is basically a function of the brain that is specifically for learning language. Biologically we have this device implanted in our minds, and it helps us to learn the languages. It is an innate biological function of human beings, just like learning to walk. LAD plays two roles in Chomsky's theory. Number one, it accounts for striking similarities among human languages. Once again, the idea of universal grammar, that how the languages, they have certain features which are similar to each other. And it accounts for the speed, ease and regularity with which children learn their first language. If you remember, with first language acquisition, we discussed that language is such a complicated thing. Language is such a complex phenomena. But a child of 2 months starts learning a language, and by age of 5, 6, 7, they are done with language learning. How they acquire such a complex things with such ease, without any effort? Because, and to support this idea, Chomsky told us that okay, they are not actually, they are pre-planned for this, they have a device for this, so that's why they do it with such ease, without any effort. If the sequence order is the same in all children, it is then quite normal to speak about language universal. Once again, as I told you, that in every language we have this idea of word order. So we can say that this is the universal aspect of human language. So this was the idea of led by Chomsky. So till here we are done with generative linguistics by Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, a big name in linguistics, modern linguistics, a new paradigm in modern linguistics, who introduced with revolutionary ideas regarding the nature of language, regarding the role of lad and universal grammar and all these things. The important element in Chomsky's ideas about language is that he was more concerned with the syntax. Once again, like Saussure, more concerned with the structure of language. This thing created certain flaws in his theories, which were later, taken into account by other linguists, like the functional linguistics. It emerged as a reaction to these approaches which have taken into account the structure of language, the form of the language. So similarly, this Chomsky's ideas, they are more focused about the structure of grammar, syntax base. If we can say that okay, the Saussure ideas about structure of language, but more concerned with morphology and phonology. Similarly, again, the Chomsky's ideas are about language, but more related to syntax. And because of his interest in syntax, he proposed with various models of grammars to explain the nature of language and to explain its analysis, like phrase structure grammar and transformational generative grammar. The phrase structure grammar, which talks about the phrases as constituents of sentences, and then further it established certain rules to see that how the phrases they can be analyzed from the sentences. Then to explain a bit further, he came up with the idea of transformational grammar, and over there the idea of deep and surface structure is important. Deep structure, the underlying deep structure, and the surface structures are different variations, or with respect to transformational grammar, we can call that they are different transformations, transformated forms of that deep structure or underlying structure are known as the subject of transformational grammar. And transformational grammar talks about different transformation rules, like for example, we have some declarative positive statement, but out of that we can make negative, we can make interrogative, we can make a question out of it, we can make a passive out of it. So the basic structure is that, the deep structure is that, like I met him on the way. Now this is my deep structure, the simple sentences. If I want to make a negative, I didn't meet him on the way. Interrogative, did I meet him on the way? So again I can make passive. He was met by me on the way. Something like that. If I'm wrong, please excuse me. But this way, according to Chomsky, out of a deep structure we can transform its shape to get different surface structures. And this was the basics of his transformational grammar. And then still there were certain flaws with his phrase structure grammar and transformational grammar, so he came up with the idea of generative grammar, which talks about the productivity of language, how out of certain fixed rules in grammar, we can create infinite number of sentences. For example, the rule tells me that okay, a sentence is simply comprised of a subject and a verb. It should a noun phrase and a verb phrase. So I can within verb phrase I can have a preposition phrase and a noun phrase and an adverbial, so many things. So I can, on the basis of these rules, I can generate so many sentences. So this was the idea of generative grammar. Then another important contribution of Chomsky was with respect to first language acquisition process. Negating the Skinner theory of behaviorism or his Skinner's explanation for language learning, the Chomsky presented his own views known as nativism or innatism. When Skinner, he said that language is learned through copying, through imitation, Chomsky on the other hand totally negated it and came up with the idea of that language learning is a biologically inherent, innate in children. The children, they are not asked to learn a language, acquire a language. Rather, they are biologically designed for language learning. And with this regard, the idea of universal grammar and a language acquisition device, LAD, are very important. Language acquisition device, it is a device which is, biologically we have it in our brains, and this device helps us to learn the language, to acquire the language without any effort, without any trouble. But at the same time, this explains the idea of universal grammar. What is there in that LAD? Universal grammar, the ideas, the ability to learn the language, the ideas that are universal to all grammars. Though this was his theory for first language acquisition, and some linguists they use this Chomsky theory to even explain the second language learning process. Though Chomsky himself was not much concerned, but still some people they used his theory to explain the second language acquisition process. So this way we have discussed in detail the Chomsky, his major contributions, his ideas, and reasons for making him such a big name. So that was all about today's lecture. Historical linguistics, we will continue it with in next week, inshallah. So see you till then. Allah Hafiz.